Good evening, dear listener. As you settle into the comfort of your bed, ready to unwind and let go of the stresses of the day, I invite you on a journey back in time, a journey that will take us to a world both fascinating and, at times, a little unsettling. Tonight, we explore a topic that might not seem so glamorous at first glance, but one that is undoubtedly intriguing: the world of medieval hygiene. Now, I know what you're thinking: hygiene from centuries ago. The very thought might make you shudder. How could it possibly compare to the sparkling cleanliness we enjoy today, with our luxurious baths, crisp towels, and fragrant soaps? Well, as we drift into the night, let me gently guide you through this sometimes pungent, but always captivating subject. In medieval times, hygiene was far from the finely tuned art it has become in our modern world. Instead, it was an unpredictable and often mysterious blend of superstition, social norms, and whatever practical solutions could be cobbled together in a time without indoor plumbing or antibacterial soaps. The very idea of cleanliness was different, and, in many ways, it was more about what was avoided than what was embraced. Imagine a time when bathing was considered something almost dangerous, a practice to be feared more than the plague itself. Yes, you heard that right, people once avoided water like the plague, literally. In medieval Europe, water wasn't viewed as a refreshing cleanse, but as a potential gateway to illness. A warm bath? That could open your pores and let the evil spirits of disease invade your body. Instead of a relaxing soak in a fragrant tub, the wealthy would settle for a gentle sponge bath, while the poor, well, they made do with rivers, barrels, or the occasional visit to a communal bathhouse, which often had its own, shall we say, questionable reputation. As we float through this story, you might start to see the humor in it all. Imagine, if you will, the daily life of a medieval noble. They would fill their wooden tub with boiling water, delivered in cauldrons by servants, and sprinkle in herbs like lavender or sage, hoping for a pleasant aroma to disguise the general unpleasantness. But here's the catch. They didn't do this every day. No. Bathing was a special occasion. It was reserved for moments when one was feeling particularly brave or particularly itchy. And even then, the act was far from a rejuvenating experience. It was more of a, well, this is better than nothing kind of affair. They might even share the bath with their spouse, floating in the same water. Ah, romance, medieval style. For the common folk, things were much less glamorous. Water was often a luxury, and most people didn't have access to the comforting privacy of a personal bath. Instead, they would wash their faces, hands, and feet using cloths and herbal rinses just enough to keep things tolerable. If the weather was kind, they might get a chance to rinse off in a nearby river. But in winter, well, cleanliness took a back seat to survival. Who could think about bathing when the cold was so biting and the need for warmth was so pressing? But even in this world of dirt and grime, medieval people weren't entirely unaware of hygiene. They had their methods, their ways of dealing with the day-to-day realities of living in a world without deodorant, toothpaste, or reliable waste disposal systems. While they might not have known about germs or bacteria, they certainly knew the importance of cleanliness, at least as much as their limited knowledge allowed. The reality of lice-infested hair, flea-ridden clothes, and the scent of unwashed bodies in crowded marketplaces made everyone look for whatever remedies they could find. Some of these remedies were surprisingly practical. Others, well, not so much. But we'll get to that. So, as we step through this medieval world, imagine the peculiar beauty of it all. Picture the dim light of a medieval street, the air thick with the smell of livestock and burning candles, mingling with the scent of garlic, an ancient remedy for body odor. Imagine the bustling bathhouses, once places of social gathering, now transformed into centers of scandalous activity. The medieval approach to hygiene was a reflection of their culture, entwined with superstition, mystery, and a deep sense of faith. After all, The church had strong opinions about what was sinful and what was not, and public bathing, that, my friend, became something to be ashamed of. But let's not be too harsh on the medieval folk. They weren't necessarily ignorant. They simply lived in a world where science, as we know it today, hadn't yet arrived. They didn't have the luxury of indoor plumbing or soap that smelled like freshly cut flowers. They made do with what they had: herbs, vinegar, and occasional sponge baths. And in a time without deodorant, they created ingenious ways to mask their natural scents, often relying on herbs like rosemary and lavender, worn as necklaces or sewn into their clothes. Think of it as an early form of personal fragrance, though it may not have been as effective as our modern-day perfumes. As you close your eyes and let the gentle sounds of this story wash over you, I hope you'll find comfort in the absurdity of it all. Medieval hygiene was, in many ways, a trial of patience, a series of attempts at cleanliness that would have us shaking our heads today, but which were entirely reasonable in their context. And so, as we drift deeper into the past, let's continue this journey with a light heart and an open mind, remembering that while our ancestors may not have had the benefit of our modern knowledge and technology, they did the best they could with what they had. Let's begin, then, in the early days of the Middle Ages, when bathing was not seen as a sin, and people still held on to the Roman traditions of cleanliness. From there, we'll watch as public bathhouses evolve, superstition spreads, and hygiene takes on a different meaning, one shaped by fear, faith, and the harsh realities of medieval life. So, let yourself relax into the story, knowing that while things may seem grim by modern standards, in the end, even the most peculiar practices can reveal something about the world they came from. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll drift off into a peaceful sleep, comforted by the knowledge that, in our own time, cleanliness comes with far fewer worries about disease, spirits, or what might be lurking beneath the surface of the water. Now, with that thought in mind, let's take a step back in time to a world where hygiene wasn't a routine, but a mystery, and sometimes a bit of a nightmare. As we ease into the past, leaving the modern comforts of deodorant and soap behind, let's dip our toes into a time when bathing wasn't something you dreaded, but something you looked forward to. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? A world where water and soap, those two pillars of our daily hygiene, were once not only embraced, but considered healthy. But as strange as it sounds, in the early days of the Middle Ages, bathing was not the risky business it later became. Oh no, back then taking a bath was actually good for you. Imagine stepping into a warm bath, the steam rising and the smell of herbs, perhaps lavender or sage, filling the air. You might even be in the company of friends or fellow townsfolk, chatting away as the warm water soothes your aching muscles. No, this is not some idyllic spa experience from the 21st century. This is the early Middle Ages, and bathing was still seen as a positive, healthy practice, thanks to the lingering influence of the Romans. Now, picture the world just a few centuries before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Romans were masters of public baths, and they had an almost ritualistic approach to cleanliness. Bathhouses, or thermae, dotted the cities large and small across the Roman world. People of all social classes could enjoy a soak in the communal tubs, scrub themselves clean, and even receive massages or enjoy a good gossip session in the steam rooms. This was hygiene at its most glamorous and ancient version of self-care, you might say. To the Romans, bathing was as essential as dining. In fact, it was one of the great luxuries of their society, an event to look forward to, and one that required a certain amount of time and social engagement. For them, a good bath was a necessity, a daily ritual that took priority over nearly everything else. But, as we all know, time changes everything. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century brought about many shifts in the way people lived, thought, and, well, bathed. With the fall of Rome came the fall of many of their customs, including the much-cherished bathhouses. A large part of the Roman bathing tradition began to fade away, especially in the northern parts of Europe, as the empire's influence waned. The once thriving bathhouses became fewer, and with that, so did the practice of regular bathing. Now, let's step into the world of early medieval Europe, where hygiene was still somewhat influenced by the Romans, but with a twist. The monasteries, those austere and often remote sanctuaries for monks and religious orders, carried the torch of Roman bathing practices. These spiritual havens, nestled in quiet corners of Europe, became the last bastions of the Roman bathing tradition. Monasteries had their own bathhouses, bathus. They were called a term that echoed the Roman thermae, but with a distinctly monastic touch. These early medieval bathhouses weren't the grandiose public spaces of Roman cities. They were smaller, more humble, but still functional. For the monks, these bathhouses were more than just places to wash. They were spaces of reflection and health, a way to cleanse both body and soul. Bathing, for them, was part of the larger spiritual discipline, a way to maintain bodily health and purity. After all, in a world that often saw disease and illness as divine punishment or spiritual consequence, maintaining physical well-being was not just practical, it was a matter of religious duty. If a monk was clean, he could better focus on his prayers, on his work, and on his service to God. A dirty body could lead to a dirty soul, or so they believed. These early bathhouses in the monasteries were rather simple, functional places. A stone bath, perhaps fed by a nearby stream or spring, was the centerpiece. There was no extravagant marble, no statues of gods and goddesses to keep you company as you soaked, just simple, utilitarian spaces meant for purification. The idea was clear. The monks were bathing to remain healthy and holy, not to indulge in luxurious self-care. And though the monasteries were quite remote and often isolated, the bathhouse still offered a sense of comfort, a reprieve from the harsh realities of medieval life. But beyond the monastic walls, things were quite different. The people who lived in towns and villages were slowly losing access to the luxurious Roman-style baths. Instead of soaking in warm water with the occasional massage, many found themselves relying on far more rudimentary forms of cleaning. Rivers, lakes, and streams became the primary source of water for bathing. Bathing was less frequent and much less thorough. And let's not forget about the weather. The cold, damp winters in northern Europe didn't exactly encourage long, leisurely soaks in the river. But people made do. The early medieval period was a time of transition. While bathing in the monasteries remained a relatively consistent practice, for most people, it was a rare luxury that was either difficult to access or deemed unnecessary. As the centuries passed, the practice of regular bathing began to fall out of favor. Superstition started to take hold, and the connection between cleanliness and health began to fray. It's funny, isn't it? The way a simple, common practice like bathing can so easily be swept aside by fear and misunderstanding. But such was the way of the world in those early centuries, where knowledge was limited, and much of life was governed by superstition. As we move further into the medieval period, we'll see how this fear of bathing, along with the changing religious and social attitudes, began to reshape the practice of hygiene in ways that would become, well, let's just say, less than glamorous. But before we dive into the darker days of medieval hygiene, let's pause here, back in this early moment in time, when people still embrace the bath as a healthy, cleansing ritual. It may have been far from the lavish spas of today, but it was a beginning, a faint echo of the glorious Roman baths that had come before. For the monks, at least, it was still a time when a good soak was seen as both a physical and spiritual necessity. For them, bathing was an act of reverence, a way to purify not just the body, but the soul. How different from the strange and often hilarious misadventures that lay ahead. As we drift further into this history, we'll begin to see how the idea of bathing would be transformed, how public bathhouses that once served as centers for health and socializing would fall victim to the whims of superstition, and how bathing itself would become something to fear. But for now, we rest in this early medieval world, a time when a bath was still a practice to be cherished, a time when the bathhouse was more than just a necessity. It was a space of comfort, healing, and even sanctity. So, as we continue our journey, let us remember that not all was doom and gloom for hygiene in the medieval world. There was a time, however, brief, when a bath was seen as a positive, healthy practice. A time when monasteries, those quiet sanctuaries of faith, kept the old Roman tradition alive, and when the act of bathing was a spiritual and physical cleansing. This, my dear listener, was the beginning of our medieval hygiene story. And from here, things would only get interesting. As we continue our journey back through the centuries, we slowly begin to watch a significant shift take place. A transformation that will eventually make us cringe at the very thought of a bath. We've left the early Middle Ages, where bathing was still seen as a healthy practice, clinging to the remnants of Roman influence. But now, we arrive at a new, more mysterious time, the late medieval period, a time when the idea of cleanliness would begin to fracture under the weight of fear, superstition, and a profound misunderstanding of the human body. You might have noticed something by now. Life in the medieval world was rarely as straightforward as we like to think. For every step forward, there were two steps back. The medieval mindset was a curious mix of reason, religion, and raw survival instinct. When it came to hygiene, there was no exception. While some parts of Europe were still clinging to the traditions of the Romans, the pendulum was starting to swing in a new direction, one fueled by terror and perhaps a bit of divine intervention. You see, by the time we reached the late medieval period, say, the 13th and 14th centuries, the world was a very different place. Life was harsher, diseases were rampant, and the threat of plague loomed like an ever-present shadow. And with that shadow came the shift in perception about bathing. Once seen as an act of health and holiness, bathing now became something to avoid, something to fear, even something that could kill you. Let's pause here for a moment, just to appreciate the irony of it all. You might be asking yourself, how on earth did people go from believing that bathing was good for you to fearing it like some kind of medieval death trap? Well, in true medieval fashion, it all started with a perfect storm of fear, superstition, and poor understanding of hygiene. And, of course, the plague, that little detail that completely changed how people viewed everything, from health practices to personal space. Imagine the scene. You're living in a small village in the 1300s. The air is thick with the scent of burning candles and damp wood. Your daily life is a series of struggles plowing fields, mending roofs, and keeping your family safe from the endless waves of disease that seem to sweep through your village every few years. You've heard the stories of the Black Death, that monstrous plague that seems to have wiped out half of Europe. Everyone is terrified. Your neighbors have fallen ill, and you're certain that you too will soon feel the fever take hold. Then comes the advice from the local clergy, the wise men, and the medical experts of the time. Don't bathe. Hot water is dangerous, they say. In fact, they even have a reason for it. Bathing opens your pores, and that, my friend, is like opening the door to disease. It's not just the hot water, either, no. It's the very act of exposing your body, of immersing yourself in that liquid heat that allows evil spirits and sickness to enter your body. As ridiculous as it sounds, this wasn't some fringe belief. It was the mainstream view, a belief shared by many who saw disease not as something caused by bacteria, which, of course, hadn't been discovered yet, but as a result of spiritual imbalance or a punishment from God. If you were to soak yourself in warm water, you might as well be inviting the plague right in for tea. And so, It became a widespread belief that staying dry, staying away from the dangerous hot water of the bath, was the safest bet. Now, think about the social implications of all this. People, once accustomed to bathing as a way to maintain health and cleanliness, began to shun it entirely. A bath, which was once a symbol of self-care, became a symbol of sin. Those who still dared to indulge in bathing, especially in the public bathhouses, were now seen with suspicion. What did they know that others didn't? Were they, perhaps, flirting with disaster by soaking their bodies in water? Were they secretly inviting sickness? The once social, communal bathhouses started to take on a more sinister air, their reputation increasingly linked to the spread of disease and moral decay. They were no longer seen as places for relaxation or health, but as hotspots for corruption. To really understand the gravity of this shift, we have to look at the way people began to view disease during this time. Without the benefit of germ theory, medieval folk had very little understanding of how diseases spread. Instead, they relied on more mystical explanations. The Black Death, in particular, struck fear into the hearts of every person who lived through it. Entire families were wiped out, villages decimated, and cities turned into graveyards. The medical explanations were full of confusion and superstition. Plague was said to be the result of divine wrath, astrological misalignments, or, in some cases, bad air, which we now know as a very rudimentary understanding of germs. It's at this point that bathing, once a regular practice in some parts of Europe, started to fade into the background of medieval life. People began to fear their own bodies, afraid that their pores were traps waiting to be infiltrated by disease. And as the fear of disease spread, so did the belief that any form of indulgence, such as bathing, was not only dangerous but possibly sinful. People started to turn to other methods to keep themselves clean. They washed their hands and faces with cloths soaked in herbal water, wiped their bodies with vinegar, and scented their bodies with various perfumes or pomanders made of herbs, spices, and even flowers. At least they could smell decent, even if they weren't exactly fresh. Now, let's not imagine a world where everyone was just walking around filthy. People still made efforts to maintain some semblance of cleanliness, but it was in ways that would make us chuckle today. Instead of soaking in warm baths, they would dab at their bodies with cloths soaked in water or vinegar, gently wiping away the grime of the day. The wealthy might still indulge in a bath, but it was a rare and often carefully considered affair. Hot water was no longer something to be enjoyed on a whim. Instead, it was treated like a necessary evil, an occasional indulgence that might be taken if absolutely necessary, like after a long journey or a serious illness. But even then, it was a complicated business. People didn't just casually slip into a warm tub for relaxation. No. The ritual of bathing had become fraught with anxiety. You see, the church had taken a strong stance on matters of personal hygiene. The idea that bathing was somehow linked to sin, especially in the context of public baths, where nudity and mingling between the sexes occurred, was enough to get many bathhouses shut down or at least heavily regulated. The church, ever watchful of anything that might tempt people into immoral behavior, considered public bathing a social risk. And it wasn't long before the church's influence helped to close down many of the communal bathhouses that had once been so central to medieval life. Of course, there was also the issue of modesty. Nudity was frowned upon, especially in public spaces. The idea of exposing one's body in a communal bath, well, that was practically an invitation for moral ruin. People began to believe that a naked body was vulnerable to the devil's influence, and perhaps bathing together with others, exposing one's skin to the open air, was somehow inviting sin. Bathing was no longer seen as a hygienic or social activity, but as an unnecessary, even dangerous indulgence. The consequence of all this? Hygiene, as we understand it today, went into decline for many centuries. People's fear of hot water and exposure led to the adoption of new habits, habits that, by modern standards, seem less than effective, to say the least. Still, the shift in perception wasn't entirely negative. People became resourceful in how they cleaned themselves, and the notion of staying dry became somewhat of a hygienic standard. Underwear, often made of linen, became a crucial part of personal cleanliness because it could absorb sweat and oils from the skin. Changing one's shirt regularly became as important as washing one's face. This, of course, wasn't exactly the spa-like experience we might crave after a long day, but it was a creative way of managing hygiene in a world where a full bath could mean the difference between life and death. As we drift further into the medieval period, the fear of bathing gave rise to other strange and somewhat quirky practices, all driven by superstition, fear of disease, and, perhaps, a bit of ignorance about how the body worked. Soon, even the simple act of washing one's face or hands became complicated, viewed with suspicion by some who worried that water, in all its openness and purity, would allow evil to enter the body. It wasn't just about germs, it was about spiritual danger. To the medieval mind, taking a bath could be seen as a path to ruin. But now, as we settle in, let's pause for a moment to consider what we've learned so far. The late medieval period was a time when fear and misunderstanding of hygiene and health began to cloud people's judgment. The noble practice of bathing, once encouraged for health and spiritual reasons, had turned into a taboo, a risky venture to be avoided at all costs. By now, we can almost hear the soft chuckle of history as it reminds us that people, in all their wisdom and folly, often made choices out of fear, choices that would take centuries to undo. And so, with fear firmly rooted in the medieval psyche, we move forward. How did this fear continue to shape the world of hygiene? What came next in the ongoing battle between cleanliness and superstition? Hold on, my friend, things are about to get even more fascinating and a little odoriferous. We now find ourselves at the cusp of a significant change in the world of medieval hygiene, a shift that will forever alter the way public bathhouses were viewed. Imagine stepping into the thick, steamy air of a public bathhouse during the 13th or 14th century. The sounds of water sloshing, the murmurs of gossip, and the occasional burst of laughter fill the air. It's not the serene, spa-like experience you might imagine today, no soft towels or soothing music. No, these bathhouses were more akin to a bustling, slightly chaotic social hub, a place where the health-conscious could meet, scrub, soak, and refresh. At least, that's how they used to be. In the earlier days, when bathing was still considered a virtuous practice, bathhouses were seen as communal spaces where people could cleanse both their bodies and their spirits. They were, at one point, centers of hygiene and socialization, places where people from all walks of life came together to wash away the grime of the day. But as we have seen, medieval life was full of paradoxes, and the transition from cleanliness to suspicion was swift and unsettling. The downfall of the medieval bathhouse was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of cultural shifts. It's almost as if a cloud of misfortune hung over these once hospitable spaces, turning them from havens of hygiene to dens of moral decay. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the public bathhouse, once a neutral ground where the body was washed and rejuvenated, had earned a reputation as a hotbed of sin, vice, and even disease. So, what exactly happened? And why did these innocuous buildings become the subject of such scandal and fear? Let's take a moment to unpack this, beginning with the church, which played a pivotal role in associating public baths with immorality. The medieval church had a profound influence on the daily lives of Europeans, dictating everything from diet to dress to what activities were deemed appropriate. And bathing, once a simple act of cleanliness, became deeply entangled with the moral and spiritual framework of the time. To the church, anything that involved public exposure of the body, especially the body of the opposite sex, was dangerous. Bathhouses, where both men and women sometimes bathed together, were seen as morally suspect. The mixing of sexes, often without much regard for modesty, led the clergy to view these bathhouses as breeding grounds for temptation, lust, and moral corruption. It's hard to imagine how something as simple as a bath could become so laden with moral peril. But for the church, the connection between nudity, bathing, and sin was clear. The public bathhouse wasn't just a place to get clean. It was a place where passions could flare, where bodies could be exposed, and where the devil could easily slip in through the cracks. The act of bathing, especially in public, became associated with the breaking of taboos, the blurring of boundaries between the sexes, and perhaps most dangerously, the erosion of the soul's purity. Over time, this moral suspicion began to erode the bathhouse's reputation as a healthful institution. No longer were bathhouses regarded as purely hygienic places. They became increasingly associated with promiscuity and indulgence. By the 14th century, some bathhouses had transformed into something quite different from their original purpose. These once pristine spots for cleaning up had turned into establishments where not just bathing occurred, but also drinking, gambling, and let's not beat around the bush, extracurricular activities that the church considered sinful. In some cases, bathhouses even operated as brothels, with attendants who were, shall we say, overly friendly. The line between health and indulgence had blurred so completely that even a visit to the bath could carry a scandalous air about it. To the church, this transformation of the bathhouse into a venue of vice was proof that such establishments were more dangerous than they were useful. And so, the church's moral condemnation of public bathing became louder and more insistent. Bathhouses were now viewed as places where the flesh was pampered, and the soul, well, it was just left to rot. Instead of being a place to cleanse one's body, they had become places to indulge in earthly desires. As far as the clergy was concerned, these indulgences, once tolerated, now had a direct connection to the spread of sin. To make matters worse, these same bathhouses were also thought to be incubators for disease. And here's where things get truly unfortunate. The arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century made all these fears and suspicions seem tragically prescient. The plague, which ravaged Europe, killed millions, and left entire towns and villages in its wake, was a perfect storm of tragedy and paranoia. With disease rampant and no understanding of germs or how illness spread, people began to look for someone or something to blame. The church, always at the forefront of offering explanations for inexplicable disasters, found its answer: the bathhouses. It's almost as if a single drop of suspicion fell into the well of medieval life, and the ripples that followed caused the bathhouse to be seen not just as a site of physical indulgence, but as a literal source of disease. People began to believe that by soaking in public bathhouses, they were literally exposing themselves to the plague. After all, if one's pores were open to the hot water, surely they were open to the pestilence that had devastated the land. Public baths, which had once been social hubs, now became the focus of growing fears about contamination and contagion. At the same time, medical knowledge was limited. Physicians didn't understand the germ theory of disease, and so their treatments for the plague were often ineffective and sometimes outright harmful. They would encourage remedies that had little to do with fighting the actual causes of illness and more to do with symbolic acts. For example, the use of aromatic herbs to ward off bad smells, like burning rosemary or using pungent perfumes, was a common treatment. But this was less about hygiene and more about trying to make the air clean in the absence of a true understanding of how disease spread. And so, bathhouses became increasingly linked to the spread of the plague. Their once innocuous role as a place for cleansing became overshadowed by the fear that they were spreading the very thing they were supposed to prevent. With the Black Death as a backdrop, the moral and medical suspicions surrounding bathhouses reached a fever pitch. By the late medieval period, many public bathhouses were shut down, condemned as sites of sin, disease, and moral degradation. The church was quick to point fingers, and the authorities were swift to close them down. As Europe's population struggled to recover from the devastation of the plague, public bathhouses were increasingly abandoned, leaving behind only the memories of what they once represented: health, cleanliness, and community. But of course, history has a funny way of distorting things. Even as these bathhouses were shut down and banned in many places, they didn't entirely disappear. Some continued to operate in secret or under the radar, becoming places of illicit pleasure, even as their association with vice and disease grew stronger. The lingering image of the bathhouse as a place of moral depravity remained for centuries, and as the Middle Ages wore on, bathing itself would become a rare, even suspect activity, something only the bold, the wealthy, or the desperate would engage in. A full-body bath? That was for the reckless. In the wake of all this, the concept of cleanliness itself began to take on a different meaning. Hygiene wasn't about keeping the body clean anymore. It was about keeping the soul untainted. The act of scrubbing away dirt and grime wasn't a priority, avoiding sin was. And so, personal hygiene fell by the wayside, and in its place, medieval society adopted new methods of cleaning, like wiping oneself down with vinegar, soaked cloths, or using the herbal concoctions we mentioned earlier. People might have been cleaner, but they were no longer as concerned about their physical health as they were about their spiritual purity. A strange shift had taken place, and bathing was no longer part of the equation. So, how did we go from a world where bathhouses were hubs of hygiene and social interaction to one where they were seen as scandalous, sinful, and even dangerous? Well, it's a story written in the steam of those long-ago bathhouses, in the plagues that swept through Europe, and in the fervent whispers of the Church's warnings. What was once a simple act of self-care became a moral battleground, a symbol of everything that was wrong with society. By the end of the 14th century, the bathhouse had gone from being a place of health to a place of scandal, and not just any scandal, but a scandal that would echo through the centuries. Now, as we look back on this era, we can laugh at how far we've come from avoiding water like the plague to filling bathtubs with essential oils and bubble baths. But at the time, these fears were very real, and the consequences were lasting. Bathhouses were no longer seen as places of rejuvenation. They were sites of danger, scandal, and even death. And so, we turn the page in our story, leaving behind the bathhouses of the medieval world, which have now faded into a distant, steamy past. But as we move on, we can't help but smile at the strange and twisting journey hygiene has taken, from community to scandal, and perhaps just maybe we'll think twice before taking our next bath. Now, we've arrived at the next chapter in this peculiar and pungent journey through medieval hygiene. After the fall from grace of the public bathhouse, and with the influence of the Church spreading across Europe like a thick, musty fog, bathing, or more specifically, full-body bathing became something to avoid at all costs. You see, by the late medieval period, the idea of submerging one's entire body in water had gone from being a healthy, virtuous practice to a risky, even sacrilegious one. In fact, many people simply stopped bathing altogether, adopting a less is more approach to cleanliness. If they couldn't scrub down in public bathhouses, they'd do their best to keep their bodies dry and avoid anything that might expose them to the dangers of, well, being clean. So, what's a medieval person to do when a full-body bath is seen as a ticket to disease, scandal, or damnation? Well, most people, naturally, started to get creative, in the grand tradition of making do with what you've got. They found alternative ways to maintain a semblance of hygiene while steering clear of the dreaded bath. The rich, of course, were an exception, but even for them, a bath was rare, almost ritualistic in its rarity, and often done with extreme caution. Let's start with the masses, the common folk. Imagine you're living in a cramped stone house in a village. It's cold, it's damp, and you've been working in the fields all day. You haven't had a full bath in, well, probably months, maybe longer. The idea of undressing and soaking your entire body in hot water seems not only indulgent, but downright dangerous. You've heard the rumors the church has warned you time and time again. Don't bathe too often. It's not natural. It's not holy. And besides, there's always the risk that the water will invite illness right into your pores. So, what do you do instead? You wash the essential bits, hands, face, and feet, and avoid the full body soak that could prove fatal. After all, if your hands and face are clean, who's going to notice the grime under your tunic? Who's going to question your smell when you're all bundled up in layers of wool and linen? It's practical, it's modest, and frankly, it's probably safer than plunging into a communal bath that might have hosted the plague just a few days ago. As for the feet, well, they got special treatment. You see, in the medieval world, feet were a big deal. They did the most walking, endured the most mud, and, frankly, had the highest probability of becoming a festering swamp of filth. And so, people found ways to address this issue without indulging in a full bath. Small foot baths, sometimes no more than a basin of water and a handful of herbs, became a sort of rite of cleanliness. Not that it was glamorous. No soft scrubbing brushes, no luxurious soak with bath salts, just a simple, practical approach to dealing with stinky, sore feet after a long day of trudging through muck and mire. It's amusing to imagine, isn't it? A world where people couldn't or wouldn't bathe fully, but were somehow satisfied with a strategic cleaning of the most exposed, often the most offensive parts of their bodies. If you were lucky, you might even have access to some sort of herbal rinse for your hair, a quick splash of rosemary or lavender-infused water to give it a clean scent. But let's be real, those medieval hairstyles, often long and unkempt, didn't exactly scream fresh. They probably scream more along the lines of smelly and windswept from a month in the fields. But here's the kicker. While the common folk were embracing this minimalist approach to hygiene, the rich weren't exactly rolling in the suds either. Oh sure, the nobles had access to more luxurious surroundings and could afford to have water carted into their homes, but even for them, a full-body bath was rare. Why? Because of that same fear that had taken hold of everyone. The belief that bathing too frequently could be hazardous to your health. So, wealthy individuals would use a much more conservative approach if they bathed at all. Instead, they would dab at themselves. Yes, that's right. They'd use cloths soaked in water, maybe infused with a little rose water or vinegar to wipe down their skin. These cloths would be gently dabbed over the face, the arms, the chest, and occasionally, if you were feeling particularly risky, the feet. Full body immersion was off limits, even for the rich. They could afford all the hot water they wanted, but who needed it when they had linen sheets, perfumes, and herbs to mask the natural odors of their skin? It's almost laughable, isn't it? The very wealthy, the people who had access to the finest resources and servants, still had to rely on these dainty, half-hearted efforts at personal hygiene. Imagine being a nobleman, having an entourage of servants preparing a bath for you, only to stand in front of a basin of hot water and just dab. No long, luxurious soak, no frothy bubbles, no soothing, spa-like experience. Just dabbing as though your entire body were a delicate piece of fine porcelain that needed to be preserved at all costs. A far cry from the indulgence we associate with the rich today. As strange as it sounds, this aversion to full-body bathing extended even to personal care routines. When it came to hair, for example, full washing was simply not in the cards. Instead of using water and soap to cleanse their hair, many people, especially the wealthy, relied on dry methods, brushing, combing, and the occasional scented powder to keep their hair clean. Of course, this had little to do with washing out dirt or oils. Instead, it was about maintaining appearances. The idea was to keep your hair shiny enough to look presentable, but not so clean that you risked opening your pores to disease. The rest of the body? Well, that was a different matter entirely. At the height of this hygienic anxiety, even the simple act of changing clothes became a form of personal cleansing. The wealthy were known to have linen undergarments, worn beneath their wool tunics or other heavy outer garments. These undergarments, washed regularly, acted as a kind of filter, absorbing sweat, oils, and grime before it could make contact with the outer layers of clothing. The idea was that your outer garments might not get a regular washing, but as long as your linen undergarments were fresh, you could maintain an air of cleanliness. This system worked reasonably well until, of course, the weather got too hot or too cold, and the layers of clothing became unbearably thick. In some places, the wealthy would even have their servants help with the delicate task of freshening up by heating water, applying rose water or lavender, and performing a sponge bath for them. Imagine rich, regal individuals receiving a sponge bath from their attendants. It's not the royal bath you might envision in a tale of kings and queens. No grand marble tubs or cascading waterfalls, just a sponge and a servant who knew better than to bathe you fully. But here's where it gets even more curious. While the masses avoided full-body baths for fear of illness or moral degradation, the wealthier classes also avoided bathing for reasons related to fashion. The full-body bath was seen as something far too earthy, too common for their esteemed high-born selves. Taking a bath was, in their minds, something only the lower classes did. It was dirty work. The nobility, meanwhile, preferred the cleaner, more refined ritual of dabbing at their bodies with scented cloths, pretending that their precious selves never came into direct contact with the unpleasantness of water. But while these attempts at cleanliness may seem comical from a modern perspective, they were driven by a very real fear, a fear of disease, a fear of impurity, and a fear of scandal. For the wealthy, the appearance of cleanliness was paramount, even if it meant sacrificing actual cleanliness for the sake of reputation. And for the common folk, who were living in constant proximity to dirt, disease, and discomfort, the idea of staying dry and avoiding full-body baths seemed like the only reasonable choice in an unpredictable and often terrifying world. So, here we are, a world where people, both the rich and the poor, avoided full-body baths in favor of less radical forms of cleaning, from foot baths to dabbing with cloths. The practice of full immersion in water had fallen out of favor, not just because of religious and social restrictions, but because the fear of disease, the growing association of bathing with sin, and the belief that hot water invited the plague were simply too great to overcome. And yet, despite all this, life went on. People continued to find ways to stay clean, even if those methods were far from what we would consider hygienic today. By the end of the medieval period, the ritual of full-body bathing was all but lost, replaced by the new, safer, more socially acceptable practices of dabbling, wiping, and simply staying dry. It's a strange chapter in history, isn't it? A world where cleanliness was feared as much as it was desired, where the rich and poor alike grappled with how to navigate the world of hygiene in a time of superstition, disease, and evolving social norms. But this, dear listener, is just another twist in the long, winding road of medieval hygiene. And as we move forward, we'll see how these practices, however ridiculous they may seem, shape the future of personal cleanliness and hygiene for centuries to come. As we continue our voyage through the labyrinthine corridors of medieval hygiene, we now arrive at a truly fascinating and rather abrasive chapter. Welcome to the world of soap, medieval soap, that is. And no, this isn't the gentle, lavender-scented liquid soap we've come to know and love today. In fact, the medieval world's relationship with soap was anything but luxurious. Imagine, if you will, a harsh concoction of animal fat and wood ash, a recipe that sounds more like something you'd use to scrub a dirty pot than to cleanse your body. This wasn't the soothing experience you might picture in a modern bath. No, this was soap in its raw, unapologetically rough form. So, how exactly did the people of medieval Europe use this strange, sooty, gritty mixture? And why wasn't it the everyday hygiene product we might expect it to be? Let's dive into the sticky, grimy world of medieval soap and find out. The first thing to understand about soap in the medieval world is that it wasn't primarily used for personal hygiene. Now, this may seem odd to us, considering how synonymous soap is with cleanliness today. But back then, soap's main purpose was not to wash the human body. No, my dear listener. Soap was regarded as something you'd use to clean your clothes. That's right, soap, when it was used at all, was seen as a tool for laundry, not for self-care. And why was that? Well, for one thing, the harsh nature of the soap made it unsuitable for regular use on skin. Its primary ingredients, animal fat, usually from pigs or sheep, and wood ash created a mixture that, while effective for cleaning fabric, was a bit too effective for the delicate skin of the human body. But let's take a moment to appreciate just how medieval this soap really was. Imagine yourself living in a bustling medieval town. You've got your dirty clothes, your wool tunic, caked with sweat and dirt from the day's work. The air smells like animals, mud, and, well, people. You have little access to fresh water, and even less to personal care products. But there's good news. You've got soap. Well, sort of. It's not the gentle, creamy stuff you might imagine. Instead, it's a caustic, almost burning blend of rendered animal fat and ash, churned into a slurry. The soap doesn't come in convenient bars or bottles like we have now. Nope, it's typically a sticky, unrefined paste. Think of it more like a sludge that you smear onto your clothes and then scrub until your arms ache. The process of making soap was tedious, to say the least. You'd have to carefully combine the animal fat, which was often rendered from slaughtered pigs, with alkaline substances like wood ash or lye to create the caustic mixture that would eventually become soap. The mixture would then be boiled for hours, and once it cooled, it could be poured into molds or used directly on fabric. The result? A very potent, very rough substance that could strip away oils, dirt, and grease from clothes or anything else that was unfortunate enough to be in its path. But here's the twist in the tale. Because this soap was so harsh, it wasn't something you dare use on your skin. Imagine scrubbing yourself down with a substance that could probably remove layers of grime from your tunic and your skin. It was a practical solution for cleaning clothes, but when it came to using it on the human body, people thought twice. After all, skin wasn't just something to clean, it was something to protect. Washing your face or hands with soap like that? Well, it was something you'd do in a dire situation, or perhaps if you needed to clean up before a major event or a special occasion. But soap was definitely not a luxury item you'd treat yourself to every day. Now, let's not think that medieval people were simply content with being dirty. They did care about hygiene, in their own way. They just had to get creative with their methods, since using soap on the body was not exactly a viable option. Instead of bathing regularly, they relied on partial cleaning methods, like wiping their bodies with cloths soaked in water or vinegar. When it came to washing their hair, they might use herbs, vinegar, or even beer, which honestly doesn't sound too bad. The idea was to stay just clean enough, without the risk of soaking too much, exposing oneself to too much water, or, worse yet, opening the pores to the very diseases they feared. In fact, when it came to actual personal hygiene, face, hands, feet, The medieval world had a much subtler, gentler approach. People didn't scrub themselves with soap every day. Instead, they focused on keeping their hands clean and wiping their faces with damp cloths. Sometimes, the wealthy would use powders or ointments made from herbs to mask body odors, relying on fragrant lavender or rosemary rather than soaps and shampoos. The key was to smell pleasant without necessarily scrubbing away the natural oils and dirt of the day. It was all about subtlety. You didn't wash, you dabbled. Think of it as the medieval version of a dry shampoo routine. It wasn't just the harshness of the soap that made people hesitant to use it. There were also practical matters at play. For most people in medieval times, water was a luxury. It wasn't something you had access to in abundant quantities. Water sources, especially in cities, could be polluted, and hauling water for a bath could be a grueling task. As a result, personal hygiene was often relegated to a few simple, quick rituals like wiping your face with a cloth or soaking your feet in a basin of herbal water rather than indulging in a full-on cleansing regimen. This also meant that soap, although available, was more of a tool for cleaning clothes than for cleaning the human body. And yet, even though soap was mainly used for laundry, it was not without its occasional use in personal grooming, particularly among the wealthy. The nobility had access to better quality soaps, often imported from the Middle East or Southern Europe, and these soaps were sometimes milder and more aromatic. These soaps were more likely to be made from olive oil rather than animal fat, which was not only more gentle on the skin, but also much less likely to leave you feeling like you'd just been scoured by a medieval scrubbing brush. However, even for the wealthy, these soaps weren't a daily luxury. They were reserved for special occasions or important events, weddings, feasts, or perhaps a visit to the church. Soap became, in a way, an event. When it was used, it was done so with great care and ceremony. It wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about presentation. It was as if you were preparing for a public showing of your cleanliness, something that was meant to convey both your wealth and your social status. Cleanliness wasn't a personal matter in the Middle Ages, it was a social one. To bring all of this full circle, let's take a step back and consider the role of soap in medieval life. It was a tool for cleaning things, not people. The harsh mixture of animal fat and ash didn't really have a place in the intimate act of personal hygiene, but it did serve a crucial purpose when it came to the practical matter of cleaning fabric and laundering clothes. But personal care routines, those were different. A medieval noble might rub a little rose water on their hands, or perhaps wash their face with a cloth. But when it came to bathing and scrubbing down the body, that, dear listener, was something altogether rarer and more dangerous. It's funny, isn't it? Today we can't imagine going a day without using soap, washing our hands, scrubbing our faces, and even lathering up in a nice shower or bath at the end of a long day. But in the medieval world, soap was something that was avoided in favor of more subtle, safer alternatives. It was a tool for cleaning clothes, not for keeping the human body clean. It wasn't something you used for a nice long soak in the tub. And when it was used on the body, it was with a great deal of caution. So, as we leave the world of medieval soap behind, we can't help but reflect on how different our world is today. In many ways, the medieval approach to hygiene was governed by fear of disease, fear of spiritual impurity, and fear of the unknown. Soap was just another reminder of the lengths people went to in order to keep themselves safe, clean, and mostly odor-free, in a world full of mystery and uncertainty. And so, we move on, out of the world of harsh soaps and into the next chapter of medieval hygiene. Will things improve? Will we finally see a return to the comforts of modern cleanliness? Or are we destined to live in a world where fear and superstition continue to rule the way we think about personal care? Hold tight, because the next part of this journey is going to surprise you. Ah, yes, the wealthy. those fortunate souls who could afford luxuries beyond the reach of the common folk. In the realm of medieval hygiene, the upper class had one distinct advantage: access to a higher quality of life, which extended even to their personal care routines. But while they could afford better materials and more space, they were still bound by the same medieval superstitions and fears that governed the masses. So, how did the wealthy navigate the murky waters of hygiene in the Middle Ages? Was bathing their personal spa experience, or were they also caught up in the same fears and misunderstandings that plagued the rest of society? Let's take a closer look. First, let's paint a picture of what it would have been like for the wealthy to bathe in medieval times. The idea of stepping into a luxurious, marble-clad bathroom filled with plush towels and essential oils is, of course, a modern fantasy. In the Middle Ages, bathing for the wealthy was still a bit of a ceremonial event, one that required a fair bit of planning, as it was far from an everyday luxury. In fact, full-body baths were rare for the aristocracy. They bathed less frequently than we might imagine, perhaps only once every month or so. But when they did, the process was far more elaborate and careful than what the common folk experienced. You see, bathing in the medieval world wasn't about simply rinsing off the grime. It was about managing risk. The wealthy, just like everyone else, had been taught to fear the dangers of excessive bathing. A full-body soak, especially in hot water, was seen as a potential invitation for illness or even spiritual corruption. Bathing too often? Dangerous. Bathing too infrequently? Also dangerous, but for a different reason. The body's natural oils and dirt buildup could lead to unpleasant odors and infections. So, what did the nobles do? They adopted a cautious middle ground. The first step in their bathing ritual was preparing the water. The rich had the luxury of servants to do the heavy lifting. Imagine being a wealthy noble, living in a grand stone castle or manor house, where your personal attendants had the task of boiling large cauldrons of water to bring to your bath. No luxurious indoor plumbing or faucets back then. Everything had to be transported manually. Servants would fill large tubs with hot water that had been carefully heated over a fire. And then, for added fragrance and purification, herbs like lavender, rosemary, or sage would be added to the water. This wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about purity, and the herbs helped create a pleasing aroma that might, in some way, offset the pungent reality of medieval life. But here's where it gets interesting. Once the bath was prepared, who exactly would bathe in this boiling, herb-infused water? A nobleman would certainly not bathe alone. No, it was common for spouses or even close family members to share the bath, especially if the water was limited. So, imagine this. A husband and wife, perhaps sitting side by side in a large wooden tub, both of them trying to relax as they scrub off the day's dirt and grime. It's a little different from the personal solo bath experience we might picture today, isn't it? No solo bubble baths here, just the intimacy of shared space and shared risk, as both partners hope to come out clean, physically and spiritually. Of course, there were other peculiarities about the wealthy and their bathing habits. Since water was such a precious commodity, they didn't have the luxury of an endless supply. The tub, once filled with hot water, was not easily replaced. So, the wealthy tended to take extra care when it came to how they bathed. They would often wash in parts, dipping cloths into the hot herbal water and carefully scrubbing different sections of the body. It wasn't so much a soak as it was a spot cleaning, a little dabbing here, a little scrubbing there. The process was far more delicate than the communal baths of earlier centuries, where people would soak in the same water with strangers. No, the nobles were trying to maintain a sense of sanctity, both for the body and the water. It's almost as if the bath itself was a sacred ritual, one that required patience and care. And while the water was certainly important, the real luxury came in the form of the other pampering rituals that followed the bath. After soaking and scrubbing, the wealthy were often treated to massages with oils or scented balms. Sometimes, attendants would even use fine towels to pat the body dry, avoiding any rough contact that might disturb the purity of the bath. For the wealthy, this was a time to indulge in the fantasy of cleanliness, to feel as though they were truly free from the muck of the world outside their castle walls. But it wasn't all pampering after the bath. A quick change of clothes was essential, as the nobles didn't just get clean, they had to stay clean. New garments, often made of fine linen or silk, would replace the soiled tunics they wore before. This was a process steeped in symbolism, not just hygiene. It was a ritual of refinement and wealth. But the nobles weren't entirely immune to the anxieties and limitations of medieval hygiene. Their precious baths might have been better prepared, but they too faced the same risks associated with hot water and excessive bathing. The medieval understanding of germs, bacteria, and illness was practically non-existent, and so there was always the nagging fear that too much bathing could weaken the body or, worse, invite disease. This fear wasn't just based on superstition, it was rooted in the belief that excessive water exposure could somehow open the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to the evils of the air, the earth, and of course, the plague. Even so, the nobility managed to carry on, bathing in their own way, perhaps a little more cautiously than we would expect. They indulged in their rare bath days, treating it as both a physical and social ritual. But when it came to hygiene, it was a fine balance between excess and avoidance. The rich were not strangers to dirty clothes. No, that would have been scandalous. But they were also not as committed to daily, intimate cleanliness as we might expect in modern times. Their spot washing and occasional spa day-like rituals were enough to maintain a sense of dignity and social propriety. But the rest of their hygiene? Well, that was a more private matter, handled with discretion and much less frequency. So, while the wealthy may have had access to better conditions and more elaborate bathing routines, they too lived in a world of fear and superstition when it came to hygiene. Their baths, though perhaps more luxurious than those of the common folk, were still fraught with caution. Water, even for the rich, remained a double-edged sword, a symbol of cleanliness. Yes, but also a potential source of contamination. They might have been able to share a bath with their spouse, but the idea of a communal soak with strangers was far behind them. Water was now a private affair, even if it was scented with herbs and prepared by servants. But what of the poor? What options did they have for bathing? Well, to put it bluntly, the poor had to be far more resourceful than the wealthy. They didn't have servants to boil water for them or private chambers to retreat to for a little personal pampering. For the lower classes, hygiene often meant making do with what they could find: rivers, barrels, and occasionally whatever water they could collect from nearby wells or communal fountains. If you were lucky, you might get to wash your feet in a river after a long day's work. Or if you were really fortunate, you could bathe your whole body in a barrel of water, often shared with family or friends. Rivers and streams were the primary sources of bathing for the common folk, and these public washings could be a sight to behold. People would gather at the riverbanks, scrubbing themselves with the limited amount of soap they had, or more likely, using a rough cloth or their hands to clean themselves. If the river was especially filthy, well, that was just a hazard of living in medieval times. Even so, the poor did what they could to stay clean, but full-body washing was rare, and for the most part, hygiene was focused on the essentials: face, hands, and feet. Any excess? Well, that was a luxury no one could afford. As we turn the page and leave the world of the wealthy behind, we can't help but marvel at how different their approach to hygiene was compared to the common folk. The rich had their herb-infused baths, their oil massages, and their elaborate social rituals around cleanliness. But even they had their limitations, their fears, and their deeply ingrained beliefs about what was too much when it came to water. Meanwhile, the poor, well, they did what they could with what they had. Their rivers and barrels may not have been as glamorous as the nobles' grand tubs, but they served their purpose, keeping people clean, if only just barely. The contrast between these two worlds of hygiene, rich and poor, shows us just how far apart people could be in terms of their resources, even in something as basic as bathing. For the wealthy, cleanliness was about more than just health. It was a symbol of status and refinement. For the poor, it was simply about survival, doing their best to scrape by in a world where access to fresh water and soap was limited. In the end, both the rich and the poor were trying to achieve the same thing, some form of cleanliness, but the means by which they did so were vastly different. And as we move forward in our story, we'll see how this ever-evolving battle with hygiene continued to shape the way people lived, loved, and yes, smelled. As we continue our journey through the strange and oftentimes perplexing world of medieval hygiene, we find ourselves at a rather peculiar, yet utterly practical solution to the problem of personal cleanliness: the sponge bath. Now, when we hear sponge bath, we might conjure up images of a gentle, relaxing bath, perhaps something spa-like, involving soft sponges and a soothing atmosphere. And while that's certainly a possibility in today's world, back in the Middle Ages, a sponge bath was anything but a luxurious experience. No, dear listener, it was a stripped-down, no-nonsense affair, all about getting just clean enough to avoid being too unpleasant to be around because, after all, the medieval world was a place where cleanliness was less about pampering oneself and more about survival. Let's pause for a moment and take stock of the situation. Remember, by this time, full-body bathing was a dangerous proposition. Too much water could open your pores, weaken your body, and invite illness. Plus, there was the issue of limited access to water and the belief that water itself could be harmful if used too often. So, what was a medieval person to do, especially when they didn't have the luxury of daily showers or baths? Enter the sponge bath. But instead of fluffy sponges and warm bubble baths, picture this: a coarse cloth, perhaps linen, soaked in water that had been heated over a fire, sometimes infused with herbs like lavender or sage, or, if you were feeling particularly health conscious, a splash of vinegar. This humble cloth, once thoroughly soaked, would then be used to dab away the grime that accumulated on the body. It wasn't about immersing yourself in water. It was about wiping yourself down carefully, strategically, and as sparingly as possible. The ritual of the sponge bath was focused on high-traffic areas, the parts of the body that were most likely to become uncomfortable or smelly. We're talking about the face, hands, and feet, which, as we all know, can accumulate oils, dirt, and sweat far more quickly than the rest of the body. The medieval approach to hygiene wasn't about cleaning everything, it was about cleaning what mattered. Why bother scrubbing your legs when you could just wipe down your armpits and face, ensuring you didn't smell like you'd been living in a barn for the past few months? No, the sponge bath wasn't designed to make you feel fresh and fragrant. It was designed to keep you from becoming a walking, talking health hazard. It was practical, it was modest, and in many ways, it was all medieval society could manage. Now, if you were a common person, this sponge bath was about as good as it got. Let's say you were living in a cramped, muddy village with little access to fresh water and not much in the way of comfort. Your days were spent working in the fields, perhaps tending to animals or gathering firewood. After a long day of physical labor, a full-body soak wasn't on the cards. Instead, you'd probably grab whatever water you could find, maybe a barrel, maybe a river if you were fortunate, and soak a cloth in it. You'd then proceed to wipe down your most important parts: the hands, face, and feet. Of course, you didn't have the luxury of undressing in private, so this was often done in a hurried and practical manner, keeping your clothes on and trying to get the most out of the small amount of water available. The upper classes, meanwhile, had a bit more room to play with when it came to their hygiene rituals. But even they, in many cases, resorted to a version of the sponge bath. The rich, of course, had access to better facilities, and they could afford servants to help them with their washing rituals. They would still boil water over a fire, but now they had a bit more luxury in terms of comfort. However, their approach to hygiene was still based on the same principles of limited water and careful scrubbing. Even if you had a bath prepared, it would usually be for a partial wash, a bit of a wipe here, a dab there, but not a full body immersion. The idea was to get just clean enough to be acceptable to society's standards, but not so clean that you risked opening your pores to disease. A wealthy person might even choose to indulge in a more lavish version of the sponge bath. After all, just like the rest of society, they were still trying to strike that perfect balance between cleanliness and safety. And if they were particularly concerned with their appearance or social standing, they might even have attendants use scented water to wipe down their faces and hands. Lavender, rose water, or the aforementioned vinegar could be used to give the illusion of cleanliness, just a touch of perfume to mask the underlying reality. You see, medieval hygiene wasn't so much about getting clean, it was about pretending to be clean while navigating the many dangers of medieval life, both physical and spiritual. But even with all the fanciness, the wealthy couldn't escape the realities of medieval hygiene. After all, the most important thing was appearances. You wanted to look like you had it all together. Even if you weren't doing the best job of staying fresh, you could have your hair and face dabbed with cloths, perhaps even adding a little rose water for good measure. But the rest of your body? Well, that was covered up by layers of clothing, so it didn't really matter if it smelled or not. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to hide your less than ideal hygiene beneath layers of fine fabrics, delicate fragrances, and of course, the all-important linen undergarments. Now, let's not forget about the one area of the body that received extra attention during the sponge bath ritual, the feet. We can all imagine how lovely medieval footwear must have been rough, worn leather shoes that didn't exactly allow for much ventilation. The poor? They probably went barefoot, or they might have worn rough sandals. Either way, feet were a hotbed of sweat, dirt, and dare I say odor. So naturally, they became a major focus of the sponge bath. Feet were, in fact, so important in the medieval world that they might even be washed separately, either with a cloth or by using a basin of warm water. A medieval person, rich or poor, knew that if they were going to risk getting too clean, it would be best to start with their feet. And considering the medieval world's lack of proper footwear, feet were often the source of both discomfort and frustration. Getting your feet cleaned and pampered was practically a luxury, and that's why it became a cornerstone of hygiene practices. Now, let's zoom out and consider the broader cultural implications of this spot cleaning approach. Why did medieval society take such a hesitant and conservative approach to bathing? Sure, there were fears of disease and superstition about water, but we can also point to the medieval understanding of the body. They didn't have the luxury of modern medicine or a firm understanding of how the body worked. Without an understanding of germs or bacteria, people relied on a deeply ingrained cultural logic, and that logic told them that if you washed too much, you were risking your health. The same logic applied to bathing. If you didn't wash enough, you'd smell terrible and risk disease. But if you washed too often, you might open your pores to the plague. So, sponge baths were a compromise. You got to clean up, but only in the ways that were deemed acceptable by society. You wiped down your face and hands to remove the most obvious signs of filth and discomfort, but you never fully submerged yourself in water. You relied on appearances rather than substance, masking the dirt beneath layers of cloth and fragrances. The sponge bath, in all its practical and strategic glory, became the ultimate solution to medieval hygiene, a way to get by without risking disease, without angering God, and without becoming too conspicuous. As we look back at this era with modern eyes, we can't help but marvel at how such simple rituals of cleanliness were so deeply interwoven with the culture, the beliefs, and the limitations of the time. And as we prepare to move forward on our journey through the history of hygiene, we're left with one thought. Despite all the inconveniences, misunderstandings, and oddities of medieval hygiene, they still found a way to survive. They managed to clean themselves, to keep up appearances, and to adapt to a world that was, for all its grit and grimness, still teeming with life. The sponge bath may not have been a luxurious experience by today's standards, but in the medieval world, it was as close to comfort as most people could get. Now, let's turn our attention to something equally fascinating, and, quite frankly, just as hair-raising, medieval hair care. If you thought the story of medieval hygiene couldn't get any more intriguing or maybe even a little unsettling, think again. Hair care, much like the rest of personal hygiene during the Middle Ages, was a delicate balance of superstition, practicality, and a stunning lack of modern conveniences. So, let's dive into this hair-raising subject, shall we? Picture, if you will, the average medieval person, a peasant perhaps, toiling in the fields from dawn until dusk. Sweat clings to their brow. Their tunic is caked in dirt, and the faint aroma of barnyard animals lingers around them. But what about their hair? Well, their hair might be equally grimy, not from their own doing, but from their natural environment and lack of resources. And yet, in the medieval world, hair was still a significant part of one's appearance. It wasn't like modern times, where we can easily wash and condition our hair every day without much thought. In fact, most medieval people didn't wash their hair frequently at all, and when they did, it wasn't with shampoo, conditioner, or any fancy marketable products we know today. Oh no, they had their own, shall we say, creative ways of handling their hair. Let's start with the basics. Medieval people did wash their hair, but they didn't do it often, mostly because water itself was seen as something of a risky commodity, and cleanliness wasn't as accessible as it is today. People washed their hair in the same way they washed the rest of their bodies, but far less frequently. You couldn't simply hop in the shower and rinse out the day's grime. That would have been a luxury beyond the means of most. So, how did they keep their hair in check? And what did they use to clean it? Well, here's where the fun begins. Much like the soap we discussed earlier, hair washing in the medieval world was a matter of making do with what you had. People didn't have fancy store-bought shampoos, hair oils, or salon treatments. Instead, they relied on a few basic, homemade concoctions that would be considered questionable at best by today's standards. Some used animal fat soap, made from the same boiled-down pig fat and wood ash that was used for cleaning clothes. Think of it as a rudimentary shampoo, but without any of the pleasant fragrances or gentle lathering you'd expect today. The soap worked, yes, but it was harsh on the scalp, leaving it dry and sometimes irritated. And that wasn't even the worst part. Scrubbing with animal fat soap was just part of the ritual, not the complete solution. You see, in medieval hair care, the goal wasn't so much cleanliness as it was managing hair. In a world where lice, dirt, and grease were constant companions, the real challenge was keeping your hair from becoming an outright disaster. This was particularly true for those who were less fortunate, living in cramped conditions, surrounded by animals and filth, and spending their days in the fields or factories. So, for these people, the main objective was to manage grease and lice, keep things under control, even if cleanliness wasn't always achievable. For many medieval folks, getting rid of the grease in their hair was a constant battle. Hair was often slick and oily from the constant exposure to sweat and the natural oils produced by the scalp. People didn't wash their hair every day. Heck, they didn't wash it every week either. But they did try to manage the buildup of oils by using simple home remedies. One of the most popular tricks was using egg yolks. Yes, that's right, egg yolks. which were often mixed with warm water and massaged into the hair as a kind of natural shampoo. The proteins in the egg helped to break down the oils, but the effect was less than perfect. More often than not, egg yolks were a temporary fix that required frequent repetition. They didn't exactly cleanse the hair the way we might expect, but they did the job of taming the greasy mess that came with living in the medieval world. Just imagine a medieval person carefully cracking open an egg and lathering up their hair in an attempt to cut through that day's grime, quite a far cry from the luxury hair care routines we enjoy today. For those who were a bit more resourceful, other concoctions came into play. Some people used herbal infusions rinses made from things like rosemary, lavender, or even nettles. These plants were boiled down to create a strong, aromatic mixture that could be poured over the scalp in hopes of soothing the skin, reducing oiliness, and even deterring lice. At least they smelled nicer than the animal fat soap, which was more likely to leave a faint, smoky scent in the hair. The idea behind these herbal rinses was simple: keep the hair smelling better and discourage the ever-present menace of lice. After all, lice were everywhere in the medieval world, making the fight against them an ongoing struggle. And let's not forget that many of these herbal concoctions, while not exactly luxurious, were far more pleasant than a day spent scrubbing your hair with thick animal fat soap. But here's the twist. Even the wealthier classes had to contend with hair issues. Oh yes, even those with access to better hygiene facilities weren't immune to the struggles of managing their hair. In fact, nobles had a rather complicated relationship with their hair, as their appearance was an important part of maintaining their status. They might have had better access to water and more resources, but they still didn't have the luxury of modern hair care products. As a result, they had to rely on the same crude methods of hair care as the common folk. The difference was that their hair was often styled rather than just washed, and the standards for cleanliness were a bit more relaxed. For noble women, particularly, hair was often styled with great care. Medieval fashion called for intricate braids, twists, and even decorative headpieces, and hair was often treated as an important social indicator. The goal was not just to have clean hair, but to have beautiful hair. However, this beauty came at a price. In a time when lice were a constant threat, it wasn't uncommon for noble women to wear tightly bound braids or head coverings to keep their hair neatly in place, concealing any untoward pests from view. Still, even the wealthiest women could not completely escape the nuisance of lice or the smell of unwashed hair. They would have used the same home remedies, egg yolks, herbal rinses, and the occasional bit of animal fat soap, just like the peasants. And then there's the comb. Yes, the humble comb, something we take for granted in the modern world. But in the Middle Ages, it was a luxury. A good comb was made of wood, bone, or horn, and it was a prized possession. You could comb through your hair in an attempt to rid yourself of lice, and for the wealthier classes, these combs could be quite intricate, sometimes even carved with beautiful designs. The comb wasn't just a tool for detangling hair. It was also a necessary weapon in the ongoing battle against lice, which were as much a part of medieval society as the mud on the streets. Lice weren't exclusive to the lower classes either. Nobles could suffer from infestations just as easily as peasants. Imagine a high-born lady with her beautiful braided hair delicately running a bone comb through it, trying to keep her hair free of lice. And then, of course, there was the shaving option. Monks and some priests, as well as certain noblemen, often shaved their heads, both for practical and religious reasons. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a way of keeping lice at bay, reducing the amount of hair to manage. And, considering the constant presence of lice, the decision to shave one's head was not merely about aesthetics, it was about survival. But it wasn't all just grease, lice, and crude concoctions. People had a certain respect for hair. It was still seen as a symbol of strength, beauty, and even spiritual purity. When it came to women, their hair was often viewed as an important part of their femininity and attractiveness. Hair care, then, wasn't just about hygiene, it was about preserving one's place in society. A woman's hair could signify her social status, her beauty, and her virtue. Meanwhile, men used their hair to signal masculinity and power. In the courts and palaces, where appearance was everything, hair care had a symbolic importance that went far beyond simple cleanliness. As we move beyond this tale of medieval hair care, we leave behind a world where the primary concerns were not just cleanliness, but survival in a harsh, lice-infested environment. Medieval hair care was about managing the dirt and grease, keeping lice at bay, and trying to look presentable without the luxury of modern hygiene products. It was a delicate balance of practicality and aesthetics, all while fighting against nature itself. In the end, what medieval people didn't have in terms of resources, they made up for in creativity and sheer perseverance. While the products may have been crude, the rituals surrounding hair care were anything but. And as we move forward in our story, we continue to explore how the world of medieval hygiene was shaped by the same forces that shaped the rest of medieval life: fear, superstition, and an unyielding desire to simply get by. Now that we've navigated the wild world of medieval hair care, it's time to move on to another area of personal hygiene that might make you cringe and then, perhaps, feel a little thankful for your modern-day toothbrush. Yes, dear listener, I'm talking about medieval oral hygiene. If you've ever taken a moment to appreciate the luxury of toothpaste, floss, and the soothing hum of an electric toothbrush, you might want to brace yourself, because the reality of medieval dental care was, well, something else. Let's start with the basics. How did people in the Middle Ages take care of their teeth? Was there a medieval equivalent of a minty, fresh, sparkle-toothed smile? Spoiler alert, no. The goal of dental care in the medieval period was far less about achieving a dazzling smile and far more about survival because, let's face it, a set of healthy teeth could be a rare commodity in a world where the primary concerns were not about sparkling whites, but about making it through the day without getting a tooth infection or, worse yet, tooth loss. If you think your trip to the dentist is traumatic, well, medieval folks were contending with some truly horrific oral issues, and their remedies were, let's say, creative. Dental care in the medieval period was rudimentary at best, and completely haphazard at worst. The very idea of tooth enamel or gum health was unknown. There were no fluoride treatments, no fillings, no root canals, no magical electric toothbrushes that could brush away a week's worth of meals in a minute. In fact, the concept of dental hygiene as we understand it today didn't exist at all. Instead, people had to make do with what was available to them, and, believe me, that meant some strange concoctions and techniques. At the heart of medieval dental hygiene was the humble linen rag. Yes, linen rags, those multi-purpose, worn-out scraps of cloth that had been repurposed 1,000 times over. If you were lucky enough to have access to one, you'd take that rag and dip it into some form of abrasive substance, maybe crushed mint, rosemary ash, or even burnt rosemary, and then proceed to rub it against your teeth. That's right, rubbing your teeth with a rag and a homemade paste made from whatever you could find lying around. And why rosemary, you might ask? Well, the idea behind using burnt rosemary ash was that it had a mildly abrasive quality that could help scrub away some of the grime and plaque that had built up. Plus, it probably helped with the smell. Let's be honest, in a world without toothpaste, anything that made your breath smell better was a win. Now you might be wondering, did these homemade mixtures actually work? Did they leave medieval people with fresh, clean teeth? Or did they just leave them with a mouth full of gritty herbs and ash? It's hard to say, but what we do know is that this approach to dental hygiene was more about managing bad breath and cleaning the teeth in a rudimentary, makeshift way, rather than aiming for the gleaming, pearly whites we covet today. Plaque? What's that? The concept of bacterial buildup and its role in tooth decay wasn't even on the radar, so people didn't quite understand why they were getting cavities, gum disease, or losing teeth. Instead, they focused on what appeared to be the biggest dental concern: odor. To understand why medieval people focused so heavily on breath, we need to take a quick step back and consider the reality of life in the Middle Ages. It wasn't exactly the freshest of times, with open sewage, animals wandering through the streets, and the general lack of sanitation. A mouth full of bad breath could be seen as a social faux pas, or, worse yet, a sign of illness. So, you could imagine that a medieval person might have been more concerned with how their breath smelled than with the actual condition of their teeth, hence the crushed mint and herbs. Not only did mint freshen the breath, but it also had some antibacterial properties, at least in the medieval mind it did. And since there was no modern dentistry to turn to, anything that could keep your mouth from smelling like a garbage heap was considered a win. But wait, there's more. In the world of medieval oral hygiene, there were also chewing sticks. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval folk would chew on twigs. Now, we might think of this practice as something out of an old-timey survival guide. But for people in the Middle Ages, it was just part of the everyday grind. Chewing sticks were typically twigs from certain trees like hazel or elm. And the idea was that by chewing on the end of these sticks, you could fray the fibers and create a makeshift brush to help clean your teeth. This was far from ideal, but it was better than nothing, right? For the wealthy, this might have been a bit more refined. Imagine a nobleman, for example, chewing on a fine, carefully chosen twig, perhaps even one that had been dipped in something pleasant smelling, like a rose water or scented oil. The noble class, as with most things, had more options when it came to personal care, and their approach to oral hygiene might have involved a bit more luxury. For the common folk, however, a chewing stick was simply a free and accessible solution to keep the teeth as clean as possible, and it could be done on the go, while working or traveling. The focus, however, wasn't on achieving sparkling teeth or preventing tooth decay. It was all about survival. At the end of the day, people were trying to avoid worse problems: bad breath, toothaches, or the inability to chew food. If your teeth were dirty, you cleaned them the best you could. If they were sore, you tried to ignore it after all. There weren't many remedies available for toothaches, save for some herbal concoctions or a good old-fashioned piece of cotton stuffed into the affected tooth. But the goal was always to keep the mouth functioning. Teeth weren't just for aesthetics. They were tools for survival, tools that were essential for breaking down food, for speaking, for interacting with others in a world where good health wasn't guaranteed. So, while medieval dental care was far from glamorous, there was an underlying ingenuity to it all. People were working with what they had, making the best of the situation. The fact that people had managed to make it through life with relatively few major dental issues, given the circumstances, is a testament to human resilience. After all, they didn't have access to modern dentistry. Instead, they relied on a combination of creativity, practicality, and trial and error. But as we think about the grimy cloths, mint, and ash that were used to scrub away the day's buildup, let's take a moment to reflect on how we've moved on from such primitive methods. Can you imagine having to chew on a twig to clean your teeth before facing the day? Or scrubbing your teeth with a piece of linen soaked in a mixture of crushed herbs and ash, hoping for the best? It wasn't ideal, but it was their reality. A reality where a clean mouth was a matter of practicality, not luxury. And if there's one thing the medieval world had in spades, it was practicality. Hygiene was a necessity, yes, but it was also a challenge, a puzzle that required constant adaptation and creativity. As we continue to explore the world of medieval hygiene, we'll see how every aspect of personal care, from hair to teeth, was an ongoing attempt to manage the balance between cleanliness, comfort, and survival. So, the next time you brush your teeth or rinse with mouthwash, Take a moment to think back to the days when such simple luxuries weren't even on the radar. In medieval times, the mere act of scrubbing your teeth with a dirty cloth could be the difference between social acceptance and social isolation. And if nothing else, we should be thankful for the gleaming teeth we now take for granted. The past, as always, gives us a reason to appreciate just how far we've come. Ah, the smells of medieval Europe, where personal hygiene was often a distant dream, and the air was thick with a symphony of odors that could make even the most seasoned traveler reconsider their life choices. If you've ever had a long, uncomfortable day in a crowded place and thought to yourself, "This is the worst smell I've ever encountered," just take a moment to imagine yourself walking through the narrow, unpaved streets of a medieval town, a place where plumbing, deodorant, and soap were mere concepts, and the air was thick with the unmistakable scent of humanity, and not in a good way. Now, we've already seen how bathing was considered a dangerous, even sinful endeavor, and how medieval people made do with whatever they could find to clean themselves. But here's the harsh reality. Even if you tried your best, cleanliness was often an impossible standard to meet. Water was scarce, soap was a luxury, and there wasn't a Walgreens on every corner selling fragrant lotions or deodorants. No, medieval folks had to rely on the smell of the environment to do the heavy lifting. And let's just say this was no task for the faint-hearted. To set the stage, imagine yourself in the heart of a medieval town. The streets are bustling with activity market vendors peddling their goods, children running through the dirt, horses trotting by, and of course the ever-present livestock. The air is filled with the pungent odors of everything. The smell of sweat from hard labor, the musk of animals and manure, the damp, earthy scent of wet straw and rotting food. And let's not forget the sickly sweet aroma of unwashed bodies all mingling together in a thick, suffocating fog of odors. In a world without indoor plumbing, the concept of personal space and fresh air was foreign to most. People used chamber pots at night, tossing their waste out into the streets the next morning with a hearty shout of, "Garde l'eau! Watch out for the water!" That's right, folks. The waste of an entire population just dumped into the streets. And if you were unlucky enough to be walking underneath a window at just the wrong moment, you might be greeted by a splash of fresh refuse. But even if you managed to avoid the water from above, the smell of untreated sewage sitting in the streets for days was simply a part of daily life. Now, before you start wrinkling your nose in disgust, let's remember that medieval folks weren't oblivious to the fact that their environment stank. Oh no, they were well aware that a world without deodorant or indoor plumbing could get a bit fragrant. So, what did they do to mask the overwhelming stench that defined their existence? Enter the pomander, sachet, and perfume, a medieval person's answer to smell management. First, let's talk about the pomander. These little devices were essentially small, hollow balls filled with a variety of aromatic herbs and spices. Think cloves, cinnamon, lavender, and even a touch of musk. The idea was that you would carry this scented orb around with you, either hanging from a chain around your neck or tucked into your clothing, creating a small pocket of fragrance amidst the miasma of unpleasant odors. The pomander was medieval Europe's answer to air fresheners, though far less effective. As it didn't purify the air, it simply overpowered it. Much like a modern air freshener, the pomander was often used in an attempt to mask the smells that people were too embarrassed or perhaps too resigned to eliminate entirely. But let's be honest, these little clove-filled wonders were not a cure-all. Sure, you might smell a whiff of lavender or a hint of cinnamon, but it was hardly going to neutralize the scent of a crowded market, a village square, or, heaven forbid, a public bathhouse. Imagine walking through a market with people packed close together, their bodies still drenched in the sweat of a long day's labor, while the air is filled with the smell of animals, rotting vegetables, and open waste. You could carry your pomander proudly, but even that could only do so much. It was like putting a single drop of rose water in the middle of a pond. It might make a difference in a very small radius, but it wasn't going to save you from the overwhelming sea of odors. Next up, we have the sachets, small pouches of herbs and flowers that people would wear tucked into their clothing, often near their chest or around their neck. Like pomanders, the idea was simple. Use pleasant scents to disguise the less than pleasant smells of the body. You could stuff a sachet with rosemary, lavender, rose petals, or even more exotic spices if you were wealthy enough to afford them. These were often tied into small cloth bags and carried by people as they went about their business. For women, these sachets became an accessory, worn as part of their daily dress to ward off both the smell of their own body and the collective stench of their surroundings. After all, in a world without deodorant, anything that could mask body odor was worth its weight in gold, or at least in herbs. But don't think for a moment that sachets were the only solution. For those who could afford it, perfumes were another popular choice, though. I should note, these weren't the kinds of perfumes you might find in a sleek bottle at a high-end store today. No, medieval perfumes were often made from a variety of animal-based substances, including musk and civet, which, while highly fragrant, could also be described as potent. Imagine walking through a town square, and instead of encountering the sweet, floral fragrance of modern perfume, you're hit with the strong, pungent aroma of animal-derived musks combined with rose or lavender. Not exactly a light, airy scent. Wealthier individuals could even afford imported perfumes from the Middle East or Italy, but it was still an overwhelmingly earthy and musky fragrance. Perfumes weren't just for vanity. They were also a way to protect against the pervasive, overpowering odors of medieval life. These strong scents worked in much the same way as the pomander or sachet, though they might have been a little more concentrated. The rich could spritz themselves with perfumes to make themselves appear more aromatic than the average person, perhaps as a status symbol, or simply as a way to tolerate the smells of their daily existence. But no matter how much lavender or cinnamon you carried around, the underlying truth remains. The general environment of medieval Europe was overwhelmingly pungent. You could mask the odors, sure, but you could never really escape them. The smell of life in the Middle Ages was thick, unrelenting, and pervasive. Even the wealthiest individuals, cloaked in the finest perfumes and the strongest pomanders, had to contend with the realities of living in a time before deodorant, soap, and indoor plumbing. It wasn't just the people and their habits that contributed to the smell, though. The very structure of medieval towns added to the stink. Streets were narrow, often winding, and rarely paved, which meant that any waste, be it animal or human, had nowhere to go but down, and it stayed there. The stench of stagnant water, waste, and decaying matter would rise up from the streets and permeate everything: homes, shops, and even the churches. In fact, most towns didn't have any form of sewage system. You could be sitting down to a nice meal in a tavern, enjoying some hearty stew, when you were assaulted by the smell of human waste being thrown from an upper-story window. Yes, it was that kind of place. A world where the line between cleanliness and filth was not clearly defined, and where stinking streets were just a part of life. But perhaps the most unforgettable element of the medieval smellscape was the shared experience of odor. Everyone stank, more or less. If you were a peasant living in a small, one-room cottage, your day was likely filled with the smell of livestock, unwashed clothes, and the sweat of a hard day's work. If you were nobility, things were better. At least you had access to more herbs, perfumes, and clean clothing. But the reality is, everyone shared in this communal scent. The lack of effective hygiene meant that even the wealthiest individuals could not escape the overpowering stench of medieval life. At the end of the day, the smell of medieval Europe wasn't just about bad hygiene. It was about survival in a world without modern sanitation, where people had to rely on ingenuity, social customs, and whatever they could muster to combat the inevitable stench of life. In a sense, the smell of medieval Europe wasn't a problem to be solved. It was simply a reality to be endured, sometimes with a pocket full of herbs, other times with a shrug and a resigned acceptance of the world as it was. As we wrap up this olfactory journey, let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. We live in a world where we have indoor plumbing, deodorant, and the magic of air fresheners. And while our modern lives are still filled with some smells, let's be real, the occasional gym bag or fast food wrapper, the smellscape of medieval Europe was something altogether different. It was a world where odor was as much a part of life as the sun rising in the morning, and the quest for cleanliness was just one part of a larger, messier, and, ultimately, very human experience. Now that we've explored the rich, and by rich, I mean pungently rich, smells of medieval Europe, let's dive into something that might just change your perspective on personal hygiene during the Middle Ages. Linen undergarments. Yes, you heard me correctly, linen. Those humble, often underappreciated pieces of cloth, which, in the medieval world, played an absolutely crucial role in the ongoing battle against sweat, grime, and general unsavoriness. But don't be fooled, this wasn't just about practicality. The humble linen shift or undergarment was also a powerful social signal, a statement of class, cleanliness, and, dare I say, refinement. You see, in an age when full-body bathing was considered risky, possibly even dangerous, when soap was an experimental chemical concoction that didn't smell like lavender but more like something that could strip the paint off a cart, people had to get creative. And linen, dear listener, was the solution. Now, let's step into the world of medieval fashion, hygiene, and the revolutionary, yes, I'm going to call it a revolution, use of linen. It's important to first grasp the concept of how medieval people viewed cleanliness. Bathing, as we know it, wasn't the cornerstone of hygiene in the 14th century. Public bathhouses, which could have once been places of camaraderie and care, had transformed into social hubs filled with scandal and suspicion. In the face of such public fear of illness, the Black Death, and sin medieval folks turned to a much simpler, more practical solution: linen undergarments. Linen was a marvel of medieval life. It wasn't just any fabric. No, linen was revered for its breathability, absorbency, and perhaps most importantly, its ability to absorb sweat and grime. In a world where regular bathing was a distant dream, changing one's linen garments regularly became a sort of personal hygiene ritual. If you couldn't wash yourself, at least you could wear clean clothes. And in a society that wasn't exactly known for the availability of fresh water or indoor plumbing, this was as close as you were going to get to a refreshing moment. But linen wasn't just a practical necessity, it was a luxury. If you had access to fresh linen, it meant you were doing better than most, while the wealthier classes could afford to change their linen shifts frequently. The poor had to make do with what they had, often wearing the same garments for days, even weeks, until they became crusty and thoroughly unpleasant. So, yes, if you happen to spot someone sporting crisp, clean linen in a medieval town square, rest assured that person was not only more hygienic than their peers, but also sending a message: I have the means to afford fresh linen, and you, dear peasants, do not. And here's where it gets truly interesting. Fresh linen, it turns out, wasn't just a hygiene tool, it was a status symbol. Imagine the scene. The market square is filled with the hustle and bustle of medieval life. The poor mill about, their clothes stained and tattered, worn thin by years of use. Then, across the way, you spot a well-dressed noblewoman. She's not just any noblewoman, she's radiating a kind of cleanliness that is almost tangible. Her dress flows elegantly around her, but underneath, she's wearing a pristine, well-maintained linen shift. You can practically smell the lavender-scented linen from where you stand. That woman, she's rich, powerful, and knows it. And while the outer garments might show off wealth and prestige, the true wealth was in her fresh, crisp undergarments. They were a sign that she could afford what others could not: the luxury of changing her linen regularly, keeping herself and her odor at bay. Fresh linen was also a marker of discipline and self-care. Imagine waking up in your modest peasant hut, crawling out of bed after a long, sweaty day of labor. What's the first thing you do? Probably wash your hands and face with a damp cloth, wipe down your feet, and if you could, change into a fresh, clean shift. For the peasant, this was about survival, hygiene, and feeling like you had a little dignity in a world that often stripped it away. For the noble, however, changing into a fresh, unsoiled linen garment wasn't just about hygiene, it was about keeping up appearances. The wealthiest people would likely change their linen undergarments several times a week, perhaps even daily, ensuring that their skin, which had been hidden away under layers of fine wool or silk, remained as immaculate as possible. Now, while the wealthier folks enjoyed regular linen changes, they were still living in a world where they didn't exactly have the luxury of bathing daily. However, they had mastered the art of managing their bodies through the power of fabric. These linen undergarments, or shifts, were often worn underneath a full set of clothing, acting as a barrier between the body and the more unpleasant outer layers. And as I mentioned earlier, they were absorbent, perfect for soaking up sweat from the day's exertions. But let's not get too lost in the fantasy of linen's magic. The reality was that the poor, who couldn't afford such regular linen changes, had to rely on other means of hygiene, likely dabbing themselves with a damp cloth and wiping down their body when it became unbearably soiled. It's easy to imagine that for the peasants, their linen garments might have been in a perpetual state of just clean enough. In fact, many peasants wore what was called a shift or smock, which, while comfortable and breathable, could become unbearably grimy after a day of labor. So, the poor were left with a choice: keep their shifts on until they could afford a change, or go without and risk the discomfort and ridicule of their neighbors. It's also important to mention that the linen shift wasn't exactly washable in the way we might think of laundry today. Most people didn't have access to a washing machine, and water itself wasn't as readily available. Instead, linen garments were often washed using lye soap or soaked in vinegar to help remove stains and smells. The process of washing linen was an arduous task, often done at riversides or with the assistance of family members or even hired laundresses. This made linen garments even more valuable because, quite simply, washing them wasn't as easy as throwing them into a laundry basket. Interestingly, the process of washing and caring for linen was more than a mere chore. It was a community event. In villages, groups of women often gathered at rivers or communal laundries, where they would sit for hours scrubbing and rinsing linen garments. It was a time for gossip, socializing, and catching up with neighbors. For the wealthy, linen care was handled by servants or laundresses, but for the lower classes, it was an essential part of life and, sometimes, the only respite they'd have to interact with their community. As we continue this journey into the linen revolution, it's essential to recognize the many ways in which this fabric transformed hygiene practices in medieval Europe. From the way it kept people clean in a time when bathing was seen as a risky endeavor, to how it became an indispensable part of a person's daily wardrobe, linen helped create a sense of normalcy in a world that was anything but. And while today we may take for granted the ease of hopping into a shower and applying a little soap and water, medieval folks had a different approach to hygiene altogether, and it all came down to their connection with linen. So, the next time you step into your fresh, crisp sheets, just remember, what we now consider simple luxury was once a revolutionary act of personal care and cleanliness, a tiny thread of civilization in an otherwise grimy, sweat-soaked world. The linen revolution wasn't just about fabric. It was about dignity, status, and a medieval approach to survival that still manages to smell a little bit better than a world filled with unwashed bodies and rancid air. In conclusion, linen undergarments weren't just a hygiene tool. They were a sign of class, cleanliness, and, perhaps most importantly, survival. By managing their linens and their appearance, medieval people found a way to navigate a world where water was precious, bathing was suspicious, and cleanliness was a luxury few could afford. And as we move on, let's take a moment to appreciate the humble linen shift, a fabric that did more than just soak up sweat. It carried with it a sense of status and civilization, even in a time when most of Europe was mired in muck. Ah, pests, those relentless tiny creatures that plagued, and I mean plagued, the medieval world. No, I'm not talking about the kind that scuttle across your kitchen floor at night, or the occasional mosquito buzzing around your ear in the summer. I'm talking about the real living nightmares. Lice, fleas, and mites. These little critters were not only ubiquitous, but, in many ways, considered a completely normal part of medieval life. Think about it. If your daily routine didn't involve scratching your scalp, or the constant battle against tiny biting creatures that seemed determined to make your life miserable, well, you were either extremely fortunate or living in a place where the concept of personal hygiene was a distant myth. So, picture this. You're a medieval peasant, working long hours in the fields or tending to animals in a small, dark hut. You've got dirt under your fingernails, a good layer of sweat on your brow, and maybe even a few fleas hopping around your legs. No big deal, right? For most people in the Middle Ages, this was just an inevitable part of life. Lice, fleas, and mites didn't just infest your clothing, they were part of the very fabric of your existence. In a time when hygiene was a luxury few could afford and bathing was considered dangerous, these little creatures were the invisible companions that followed you everywhere. From the poor to the rich, no one was immune to the tiny army of pests that lived alongside them. Now, before you recoil in horror, let's get a little deeper into why this was so normal and, in some ways, unavoidable. First of all, the lack of cleanliness or even rudimentary pest control meant that people lived in close quarters with both each other and their animals. Animals, of course, were essential for survival. They provided food, transport, warmth, and even work. But as much as we love our furry companions today, they came with one minor inconvenience: fleas. These blood-sucking little devils weren't just confined to the animals. Oh no, they would happily jump onto anything that moved, including their human cohabitants. Let's paint the picture of medieval life a bit more vividly, shall we? It was crowded, it was hot, it was sweaty, and it was itchy. Living conditions were tight, and the air wasn't exactly filled with fresh scents. You slept on straw, shared your space with a few chickens, and maybe a goat or two, and wore the same clothes for days, weeks, sometimes even months on end. The air in your little cottage? Thick with the smells of livestock, sweat, and, if you were lucky, a faint whiff of herbs hanging from the rafters. But those smells, as pervasive as they were, weren't the worst of it. No, that honor went to the tiny creatures who made their homes in your hair, on your skin, and, well, everywhere. Lice, fleas, and mites were like the eternal sidekicks of medieval life. No matter how hard you tried to escape them, they were always there, crawling through your clothes, gnawing at your skin, causing the kind of misery that, when you think about it, would probably make you reconsider your entire historical timeline. And while we today might have our lovely little flea collars, anti-lice shampoos, and the good old vacuum cleaner, medieval people had none of these luxuries. Their main weapon in the fight against the creeping, crawling invaders? Lice combs. Now, let's talk about the infamous lice comb for a moment. Imagine something that was probably the medieval equivalent of a toothbrush, but with far less glamour and far more practicality. A lice comb was a simple but essential tool, often made of bone, wood, or metal. and designed to sift through hair to catch and remove lice and their eggs or nits. In a world where water wasn't abundant and baths were considered more of a risk than a remedy, combing through one's hair became one of the only ways to manage the infestation. If you didn't have the luxury of a lice comb, you were, quite frankly, out of luck. But if you did have one, congratulations. You were among the more fortunate, able to tackle the constant menace of crawling critters in your hair with a little more precision. But combing out lice wasn't enough to ensure complete freedom from the pests. You see, as much as people tried to keep their hair and bodies free from these critters, they were persistent. Fleas, in particular, were notorious for traveling from person to person, infesting beds, clothing, and any fabric they could find. And while lice combs could catch and pull out the occasional intruder, there were still more ways to deal with this issue. For example, a popular method of dealing with lice, especially in clothing, was boiling them out. Yes, that's right. Clothes were often boiled in large pots of water to kill the lice and their eggs. This method was a bit like medieval laundry day on steroids. The process was time-consuming and not particularly enjoyable, but it did the trick in terms of ridding your clothes of those pesky pests. However, when it came to the human scalp, boiling water wasn't exactly an option. Enter the radical solution of head shaving. That's right. Some people, particularly monks or those who could afford it, took the extreme step of shaving their heads to combat lice. While not a common practice for most medieval people, since hair was often seen as a symbol of one's virility and strength, head shaving was a solution for those who really wanted to make sure their heads were lice-free. Imagine the relief of ridding your scalp of all those little critters in one fell swoop. On the downside, the bald look wasn't exactly a fashion statement, but hey, it was a small price to pay for sanity and comfort, right? But not everyone had the luxury of shaving their heads, and certainly not everyone could afford to boil their clothes every time the lice became unbearable. For many, the daily battle against pests was a reality they simply lived with. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't something you could really escape. But this was the medieval world, where survival was often more about adaptation than comfort. And what's a little itching when you're trying to get through another long, hard day of work? Of course, the pest problem didn't stop with just lice. Fleas, too, were a constant companion, especially for those living in close proximity to animals. You'd think that with all the bedding made of straw and the constant mingling between animals and humans, there would be some sort of natural balance. But in reality, it was more like a flea party that no one had invited you to. People spent much of their time scratching away at their bodies, trying to rid themselves of the incessant bites that marked their days and nights. And the poor were often the worst off, living in cramped, unsanitary conditions where fleas thrived, jumping from animal to human and back again. So, what was the medieval solution to fleas? While some people might have used herbal remedies or oils to soothe the itching, there wasn't much that could truly solve the problem. The rich might have the luxury of finer garments and more frequent linen changes, but the poor, well, they just had to make do. But even so, many tried to find ways to manage the flea population, whether through the use of specific herbs, the boiling of clothing, or even the act of simply dealing with it. Fleas and lice were part of the package deal of life in the medieval world, and while they were a nuisance, they weren't a sign of personal failure. They were a fact of life. The constant presence of lice, fleas, and mites became a reminder of how truly interconnected people's lives were with their environments. Hygiene and pest control were two sides of the same coin, where cleaning your body wasn't enough if your surroundings were infested. It wasn't until centuries later that modern pest control methods, like bug spray and pesticides, would revolutionize the way we dealt with these persistent little invaders. Until then, medieval people had to fight the good fight with a variety of tactics: lice combs, boiling clothes, head shaving, and an ironclad acceptance that a few itchy spots were simply part of the human condition. In the end, the struggle against lice and fleas was more than just a battle of comfort. It was a matter of survival. It was about finding ways to keep these tiny invaders at bay while navigating a world where comfort, cleanliness, and pest control were secondary to the bigger fights surviving the day-to-day grind of medieval life. And while we may live in a world today where pests are less of a constant companion, the medieval fight against lice and fleas remains a reminder of how far humanity has come and just how much was endured in the name of simply trying to stay clean, scratch-free, and, if possible, comfortable. So, the next time you're battling a tiny pest or dealing with an itch, think back to the medieval world, where head shaving was a solution, lice combs were prized possessions, and fleas were just one more pesky part of life. The medieval world may have smelled bad, been filled with pests, and lacked any sort of modern conveniences, but at least they had the grace to live with it, all scratching, combing, and boiling their way through the mess. As we draw this journey through the medieval world to a close, we find ourselves lingering in the haze of ancient smells, dusty streets, and the quiet, persistent hum of a time far from our own, a time where hygiene, as we understand it today, was still a distant dream. And yet, for all the grimness and discomfort that characterized medieval cleanliness practices, we must pause and reflect as we prepare to rest on the ingenuity, the resourcefulness, and the very human drive for survival that fueled their attempts at hygiene. In the end, though their methods may seem unbelievable to us, now wielding boiling water and vinegar as weapons against lice and using linen shifts to battle sweat, the medieval people did what they could with the knowledge and resources available to them. It is tempting to laugh at the medieval practices, to think of the times when full-body bathing was considered dangerous, or when people used ashes from the fire to scrub their bodies, all while wearing their grime as a badge of survival. But as we ease into the quiet of our modern world, where showers are as close as the next bathroom and washing machines hum quietly in the background, we must consider the context of their lives. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't about comfort, convenience, or even cleanliness in the way we imagine it today. It was a life bound by uncertainty, superstition, and a constant struggle to keep illness at bay. The medieval mindset towards hygiene wasn't founded on the principles of modern science or medicine. They didn't have the luxury of knowing about germs, bacteria, or viruses. They feared the unseen and the unknown, an unseen threat that could claim your life in the blink of an eye. Despite these fears, medieval people were far from lazy or unthinking about their hygiene. Instead, their practices reflected a deep sense of practicality and survival. Sure, their methods were less than ideal by modern standards, but the methods they used worked within the context of their time. For example, despite the widespread belief that bathing could spread disease, they found ways to keep their bodies clean and their homes habitable, even if their methods involved washing pieces of their bodies with cloths rather than soaking themselves in water. It was a system built not on the expectation of regular cleanliness, but on pragmatic necessity, using what little they had to ward off filth, pests, and disease, and to preserve their health, or at least their dignity, in a world that seemed constantly on the brink of chaos. There's a beautiful, if often overlooked, lesson in that. Medieval hygiene, like so many other aspects of life during that time, was a balancing act. It balanced fear of illness with practical necessity, superstition with innovation. They worked with what they had. Linen shifts became a status symbol and a hygienic barrier. The boiling of clothes, though primitive, was an early precursor to the modern sanitizing methods we take for granted. And while it seems almost unbelievable that medieval people didn't have soap for their daily use, they managed with herbal rinses and vinegar to maintain some semblance of cleanliness in a world full of plague and pestilence. They didn't have the luxury of indoor plumbing, Yet they had community rituals like Laundry Day at the river, where women gathered to wash garments, reinforcing not just hygiene, but social cohesion. One thing is clear: the medieval approach to hygiene, crude though it may seem, was as much about caring for one's body as it was about caring for one's spirit. The fear of disease intertwined with religious doctrine, with the notion that cleanliness might invite or repel divine favor. The Church's stance on bathing in the body reflected a fear of the flesh and its perceived weakness. Yet in the midst of these limitations, there existed a quiet, tenacious drive toward order and health. This need for cleanliness was bound to their environment, their survival, and their unyielding spirit of adaptation. It's humbling to consider how they lived, how they strove toward hygiene in a world without the knowledge we possess today. And perhaps, in our own times, as we lie down and prepare to let go of our own small worries, there's something comforting in knowing that the path to hygiene has been a long one. It didn't happen overnight. What we take for granted today, sophisticated medical practices, an abundance of clean water, convenient sanitation systems, came from centuries of trial, error, and adaptation. The medieval people, despite their seemingly crude methods, laid the foundation for modern hygiene practices. They worked with what they had, creating the rudimentary beginnings of what we now know as healthcare and cleanliness. The idea that washing could prevent illness, that clean clothing was not just a luxury but a necessity, is something that we inherited from that time. The very notion of hygiene as healthcare started in the Middle Ages, even if their understanding of germs and disease was far from modern comprehension. The late medieval period witnessed the collapse of one hygiene ideal, the public bath, and the rise of another, the idea of personal responsibility for cleanliness. The common man or woman may not have bathed regularly, but they did their best to keep themselves presentable. Fresh linen, scented sachets, combs for lice, these were the tools of hygiene, and they were adapted for the world they lived in. Today, we benefit from hundreds of years of progress, from the advent of soap to the modern understanding of microbiology. But in the medieval period, they were working in the dark, trying their best with what little they understood about health and cleanliness. The seeds of modern hygiene were planted by those early experiments, with washing, with vinegar, with cloths and soaps that didn't quite work, but were better than nothing. And though we might chuckle at the image of medieval people painstakingly scrubbing their hands with vinegar or shaking their heads free of lice, we can't help but acknowledge that their attempts were the best they could do with the tools they had at their disposal. They didn't have the luxury of understanding germs or bacteria, but they understood that cleanliness mattered even if it was only a partial understanding, even if it was incomplete. What they did was enough to keep the worst of the diseases at bay, at least for a while. As we consider their efforts, we also realize how much our modern ideas of hygiene owe to those same medieval practices. The importance of washing hands, of keeping ourselves clean in a way that prevents disease, is rooted in a much older idea, the idea that dirt can hurt. The concept of sterilizing objects, of cleaning wounds, of avoiding contamination, all of these ideas trace their origins back to a time when people had no formal understanding of microorganisms, but still grasped the importance of cleanliness for survival. In many ways, we've come full circle, with modern medicine continuing to refine and improve upon those early practices. But the core idea, cleanliness as health, is something we share with our medieval ancestors, even if their methods were less effective. And so, as we close our eyes tonight, resting our tired bodies after a long day, let us take comfort in the thought that despite their limitations, the people of the Middle Ages did their best to care for themselves, their bodies, and their communities. They worked with what they had, balancing superstition and necessity, fear and survival. In many ways, they laid the groundwork for the clean, healthy world we enjoy today. Medieval hygiene, as imperfect as it was, reflects the resilience and ingenuity of a people who faced enormous challenges with limited knowledge and resources. Their battle for cleanliness was one of survival, but it was also one of hope. A hope that even in the darkest times, they could do something to care for themselves and their loved ones. Today, we take our clean water, our deodorants, and our soap for granted, but it wasn't always so. The medieval world paved the way for the hygiene practices we now consider essential, and their efforts, though imperfect, were never in vain. As you drift into slumber, remember this: hygiene, in any form, is a part of our shared human journey, a journey that stretches across centuries, cultures, and discoveries. From vinegar baths and linen shifts to modern-day showers, we've come a long way. But in the quiet comfort of your bed tonight, take a moment to appreciate the small, humble efforts of those who lived long ago. They didn't have the luxury of our knowledge, but they did what they could, and that's all any of us can ever do.